Throughout the Second World War, there were many different men and women who were accused of spying for the enemy. If the Germans would find someone who was accused of spying, they would deal with them brutally, in quick fashion. They would execute possible spies, usually by firing squad, but there were other stories which were more barbaric, of the fate of spies. A group of women who had been rounded up, after they were captured working with the French resistance, had been found to be members of British Special Operations Executive. They were then taken to a concentration camp. Prisoners inside would later recall the screams, as these women were burned alive inside the crematoria, but all armies and militaries believed that the spies they captured were pivotal to the war effort. They were tortured to try and extract secrets and pieces of information, and those who would not give over any intel would be executed after being marked as a lost cause. But on the 11th of November 1944, one 18-year-old Polish teenager made his way to a firing squad, and he was executed by American soldiers. But what is the story of his execution? Join us today as we look at the execution of the teenager shot for spying by the Americans, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The German army would, throughout the war, following heavy losses on the Eastern Front, bring many different soldiers from countries they were occupying into their army. It got to the point where many men were conscripted, despite the fact they were not native Germans. Times were very desperate following Operation Barbarossa, and because of the losses they faced, the German army became splintered with people who were forced to join. Many did not want to join, and were made to do so, with the threat of execution or being sent to a concentration camp looming over them. Because of this, many people were forced to join the armies of those who invaded their country, and who were considered the enemies of their people. Resistance groups would be furious at this, but one country that had a number of people forced and conscripted into the German army was Poland. Around 90,000 people from Poland were forcibly conscripted into the Wehrmacht, and it was believed that by VE Day in 1945, around one-third of all Polish soldiers in the West had formerly served in the German military before. One of these men who was from Poland and saw active service in the German army was Josef Wende, who was born on the 12th of August 1926. He would then, in his teenage years when Poland was invaded by the Germans, be around 13, when the Second World War broke out with Hitler's tanks rampaging into his homeland. But young men were, as the Second World War went on, told by the German army to go behind enemy lines and to spy on different Allied formations and groups. This was of course reconnaissance, but the Allies, when they found these boys, would carry out brutal reprisals, and there were accounts of teenagers who were accused of spying being shot dead by firing squads. Josef Wende was an ethnic Pole who had been drafted into the German army, and he would be tasked by the Germans to hide out as a Polish slave labourer behind enemy lines. He would also be given civilian clothing to hide out, and this is important as it solidified his status as a spy, and it was said that those Germans who were found in civilian clothes were to be executed for spying. According to the Geneva Convention, soldiers in uniform who were conducting espionage or spy work could not really be executed, as they would be in clear uniforms and markings of the enemy, and they should have been taken as prisoners of war. It was clear that Josef Wende was conducting reconnaissance work, and that following finding out intelligence about locations of American units and soldiers, then he would pass this on to the Germans. This was pivotal, as it meant the Germans could then act upon this and strike the Allied formations. They would then try to push back different groups of Allied soldiers. The information that boys such as Josef Wende were passing was pivotal for the Germans, and it was a very important, steady stream of information that came to the German commanders. There is some debate as to whether Wende was wearing enemy uniform or not, but it's probable that he was not, due to the fact he was dealt with very severely, and he would have stuck out like a sore thumb at the time, especially in the area of France that he was operating in. Much of France at the time was being liberated by the Allies, and many people were in support of the French, and because of this, they would have handed over anyone in German uniform rather quickly and swiftly. But nonetheless, Josef Wende was captured by the American forces behind their lines. They concluded that he was a spy and was posing as a Polish slave labourer, and at the time of his arrest he was roughly 18 years old. There's a good chance he was frightened and scared when faced with the Americans, but there would be very little remorse. He was captured near to the Moselle River and Wende was actually scheduled to end his spying assignment later that day, and he was then going to rejoin the Germans and pass over the information that he had discovered when he was then arrested. It was on the 24th of September 1944 that he was captured, but on the 18th of October 1944 he would be brought in front of an American military commission on suspicion of espionage. There was some deliberation with the Americans as to the facts, but it was believed that Wende was in civilian clothes, and because of this, the book should have been thrown at him for being an enemy spy who was farming information for the Germans. Because of this, the US military commission sentenced a young man to death, and he was to await his death sentence inside of an American military prison. This was located near to Toul in France, and as the Allied armies would continue to advance and liberate lands, inside of a prison, Josef Wende would await his death. On the 11th of November 1944, he was informed by American military policemen that his time had come to an end and a firing squad had been gathered for his execution. He was led out to an execution site, which was a farmyard of a farmhouse in Toul. He was accompanied by military policemen and also a priest who was dressed in black. Wende was wearing what looked like a rough German uniform, and he was wearing a cap over his head. He looked in his final moments like a rabbit in the headlights, and looked intensely terrified and traumatised. He also looked very young. But a Catholic priest then spoke to Josef Wende moments before he was told to get back, and the priest offered prayers for the Polish boy, who was convicted of being a German spy. Following this, the priest was then told one more time to step back, and the firing squad emerged, made up of American soldiers. Final preparations were made, as Josef Wende was then tied to a stake in front of a number of hay bales that protected the Americans from ricochets, and then his eyes were covered by a white cloth so he could not see his executioners and his final moments. Also, the military policeman tied his feet together so he could not move. Then the time came for the firing squad to take the life of an 18-year-old Polish-born German spy. The executioners were told to ready, and then with their rifles they shot straight into Josef Wende, and he then slumped forward and fell towards the floor. After this, the lieutenant colonel in charge went with a doctor to inspect the body, which had bullet wounds in his chest. They then confirmed death. After this, the MPs collected the body of Wende and placed a white sheet over it, and then placed it on a stretcher before it was carried away. Josef Wende was a teenage spy who was conscripted and forced to work for the German army, and he was made to collect information about the Allies. But because he was in civilian clothing, this was enough under Allied military law to ensure his death sentence. There were many other spies who were executed in this similar manner, and some were even victims of German failed operations, such as Operation Greif. But they all had the same death sentence, and many Germans were executed by Americans for conducting espionage and work undercover. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.